Okay, this is a continuation of the quotes, and we're still in the letter A. We're going to get to Aristotle today. We'll start with Archimedes, another great of the ancient Greeks, and we'll do briefly Aristophanes. He was a playwright, another great one from the ancient Greeks. Silvano Arieti is a little more recent guy, just a little bit from him. So anyway, starting with Archimedes. Eureka, I have found it. So Archimedes was evaluating a crown that had been made for the king to determine what it was made of. And he had to figure it out based on the different densities of the metals. And he saw a public bath where the water level rose as people got into it. And that gave him an idea how to measure the density. So he ran down the street apparently in his bath towel, shouting, Eureka, I have found it. Okay, Archimedes also had said, give me a lever and a firm spot to stand on, and I will move the world. Okay, it's a bold statement, but, one can simply say, look, give me a clinic where I can teach the low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet with no oils, and I will cure diabetes, hypertension, and obesity, and usher in a new golden age of health. Good luck being allowed to let that happen. Okay, Silvano Arieti from 1914 to 1981, he says, if someone controls your ideas, they will soon control your actions because every action is preceded by an idea. I think that's why there's so much interest in shaping public opinion, is then you can control the public opinion. Like the average person thinks that, public events are like real events rather than engineered events because big money wants them to happen. Why do you think there's so much promotion of high-fat diets on the internet? Because they want to keep the pearls fat and sick. It's not a stupid person thinks everything's a coincidence and it just happens and turns out that way. A smart person knows that big money is constantly trying to influence things in whatever direction it seeks. Okay, here's a quote from Silvano Arieti. Human creativity uses what is already existing and available and changes it in an unpredictable way. Yeah, to see things in a new way. Okay, Ariosto, he was a Renaissance Italian, kind of a clever guy. He was like a gossip columnist in the Renaissance, very bold. And he used to say, man proposes, God disposes. My mother used to always say that. It used to make us laugh, and that was kind of her way of saying, there's nothing you could do about something. All right, anyways, another one he said is, nature made him and then broke the mold. All right, now we're going to get into Aristophanes. He's one of the great Greek playwrights, and they had some fantastic playwrights. Athens, probably like more per capita geniuses than any place in the history of the world. Aristophanes was a Greek playwright, and he especially wrote comedies. And he would teach through his comedies. Like he made a lot of fun of Socrates, who he thought was corrupting the youth. He also made one called Lysistra about the Peloponnesian War. He wanted Athens to make peace with Sparta, and that would have been better for all of Greece. One of the things you see, sadly, is countries where the people can't get along and they have internal fights, civil wars, it destroys the country and it makes them weak. For example, look at Ireland. My father's from Ireland, and the Irish, had all these chieftains who were sort of battling with each other, so the Irish people were not unified. And they're a smaller country, so England comes in and kicks their butt. Vikings often gave them a lot of grief earlier, too. A population needs to be unified in order to be able to stand up and defend itself. Italy had trouble with that as well in the 1500s, where they didn't have a unified Italy. Instead, they had these city-states that didn't get along, like Rome and Florence and Vienna and Milan and all this. And it made them weak, so the French could come in and dominate them at times, sometimes the Spanish, and certainly Charles V, who sacked Rome in 1527. That was a disaster. Okay, another quote for Aristophanes. Ignorance can be outgrown, but stupidity is forever. And yeah, that's true. Anybody can not know something because they haven't opened a book, but they can open a book and read and learn. But stupid people, you just can't talk any sense to them, and youthful, young men think they know everything. You can't talk sense to them. But the most common reason why people get sick and suffer terrible problems is just because they're ignorant of nutrition, epidemiology, and toxicology, NET, and it's easy to learn. You just set your mind to it. Okay, Aristophanes continues. Those impossible women, how they do get around us. You can't live with them and you can't live without them. Aristophanes, listen to both sides of a story before you decide who is right. That's like bringing owls to Athens. And the owl was sort of this symbol of wisdom and Athena, later called Minerva. Okay, Aristophanes. The wise learn many things from their enemies. Okay. All right, so now the moment you've all been waiting for. We're going to start talking about Aristotle. We'll just do sort of introduction to Aristotle. He lived from 384 to 323 BC. He's considered by many people to be the smartest person who ever lived. He's the favorite philosopher of Ayn Rand. And like I said, I give Ayn Rand a lot of credit. I think she's the smartest woman who ever lived. And if you don't believe that, go read her quotes. Go to any of these quote sites, start reading her quotes, and you're like, wow, she's right, she's right, she's right. How did she say that so concisely, so perfectly? That'll happen over and over and over again when you start reading Ayn Rand's quotes. Because all I'd heard about her before I started studying her was that she was a bitch, she was selfish, she was a jerk. But then I started reading her and I read her books, and I'm like, gosh, she was a genius, and she pushed for freedom because she had grown up in Russia when it was, becoming taken over by the Soviets. And it was a disaster for her, for her family, and she had to flee the place. So when she came to America, and that was back when America was a free country, she was just in awe of it. And she wanted to be a movie writer, and so she really studied all the different plays and the literature of the history and the philosophy of the history. And so she really knew who was who in the literature world. And then she wrote this magnificent book. Her best book was called The Romantic Manifesto. And she wrote all about how awesome the 1800s were and how people don't even realize how awesome the 1800s were. If you study art and literature, you'll see, gosh, was it extraordinary. Just look at the best novels ever written. They come from the 1800s. Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, and Fyodor Dostoevsky writing Brothers Karamazov, and Quo Vadis written by Henry Sienkiewicz, the Polish writer. They're magnificent, okay? They're beyond good. All right, so some of the things about Aristotle. He wrote a lot about metaphysics. That means meta can mean beyond or about something, beyond the scientific study of nature. A couple things. He was a Macedonian, and that was a problem in Athens because they saw him as an outsider. And the Athenians destroyed most of his book, which is sad. So one of the reasons why we know more about Plato is Plato's books were well preserved and they come down to us relatively intact. Whereas for Aristotle, a lot of times we're just looking at some student's notes, and that's why a lot of times his writings don't seem as consistent as Plato's do. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great from the ages of 13 to 15 years old. Alexander became a great admirer of Greek culture, and he spread it to every place that he conquered. Aristotle's work was like the first encyclopedia. He categorized all the useful knowledge of his time. He disagreed with Plato's collectivism. Plato had kind of been duped into collectivism mindset because he admired Sparta for having defeated Athens. But collectivism leads you down, a spiral of worsening slavery and degradation of the public. Aristotle went to study with Plato when he was only 18 years old. Okay, when you hear the word arete for the ancient Greeks, I think that's a lot about what Robert Pirsig meant with the word quality in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Dante, Aristotle is the master of those who know. I mean, few people have ever had more influence on the world than Aristotle. His books were still the standard textbooks in schools, about almost 2,000 years later, certainly 1,500 years later. Rufus Fears, he's the best professor ever at thegreatcourses.com, and here's what he said. Aristotle is the father of all modern universities. Yes, he was, and he had his own school where they would walk around with him in the streets in Athens. It was called the Peripatetic School for walking around. Aristotle disagreed with Plato on a lot of things. First of all, Aristotle said Plato is wrong when he says that women should be more like men. The fact that women are different is what makes them so attractive. And of course, Plato was older than Aristotle and had done a lot of magnificent writing by the time Aristotle was a student. And so Aristotle was influenced certainly by Plato, but I think, and a lot of people will say things like Alfred North Whitehead said all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, but I think Aristotle is actually more important, had a more profound effect on the academic system and the way of thinking and better thinking. Here's a quote by Charles Murray from his book Human Accomplishment. Aristotle's understandings of virtue, the nature of civilized polity, of happiness, and human nature have become so integral a part of Western culture that to be a European or an American and hold so-called mainstream values of the time when he wrote the book are to be an Aristotelian. Okay, so he wrote this book a while ago, Charles Murray. He did a lot of study on human intelligence and on the great achievements of Western civilization. And people should stop with this multicultural nonsense. There is no civilization that's achieved anywhere near as much as Western civilization. Okay, the Aztecs had a calendar. That's nice. Okay, other cultures did a few great things. That's nice. There's nothing remotely even close to Western civilization's achievements, and that's why everybody wants to move to the West. And sadly, that's why the big money is destroying the West, because it doesn't want there to be anywhere good for the proles to move to. Okay, here's a line from Arthur Herman from The Light in the Cave. This is the best book ever written on the history of philosophy, The Light in the Cave. It's much, much better than Bertrand Russell's book. Bertrand Russell's book is kind of weak, his history of philosophy. I read that several times in my life because my father read it when I was young, and I wanted to be like my dad. But the more time goes by, the less I sort of respect Bertrand Russell and his perspective on philosophy. The more I respect Arthur Herman's, the more I respect Aristotle. And the reason is they promote freedom. They promote individualism. They promote individual achievement. And you need to have that if you're going to develop a society. Okay, so here's the quote from Arthur Herman from his book. The School of Athens painting by Raphael is a grand summing up of Western civilization's debt to the ancient world, and perhaps the two greatest minds of all time, Plato and Aristotle. They're right in the center of it. Aristotle was like a vacuum for information. He sucked up all the knowledge of his time. And, like I said, he made the equivalent of an encyclopedia of his time, of what was known. And probably only about 25% of what he wrote survived, sadly. He was the son of a doctor. He was very interested in biology. And he sort of learned the Socratic method, the dialectic, from Plato and all his writings about Aristotle. And the Socratic method is used to answer questions and to find the truth. Socratic method of questioning, it is great for teaching because it gets the student a little bit, perked up, more alert, so they're paying attention, and it focuses the conversation. It's a lot of fun. Every doc knows going on rounds. I can remember when they were a junior medical student and resident, and a good attending would be asking them questions all the time. The Platonic dialogue format of conversation is great for exploring perspectives on a subject. And Bertrand Russell, rightly pointed out that the Platonic dialogue was great for talking about things that you were already familiar with, like discussion of virtue and justice in Plato's Republic. Okay, however, Russell felt that the Platonic dialogue was not good for discovering new facts or for actually doing science. Yeah, it doesn't work as well for topics that are new to the people in the conversation. Aristotle summarized the known methods of rhetoric. So basically they looked at what political speakers in Greece were successful and what were their methods, and they wrote them all down and categorized them and tried to explain them. This is sort of psychology in the ancient Greek world. Aristotle developed a system of logic, often using syllogisms. And here's a classic prototype syllogism. Major premise, all men are mortal. Minor premise, Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Okay, and you can see how this is really deductive logic, working with the syllogism, and that's the classic syllogism. Okay, so that's it for our introduction to Aristotle for today. We'll talk about him more next time. Hope that was interesting.